Hello, Christopher Noël here, writer and Sasquatch researcher. Today I'm going to talk for a few minutes about Sam Harris, who is a philosopher and ethicist, well known for his rigorous stands against religion and moral relativism. Among his most widely discussed claims is that human free will is an illusion. So I thought I'd toss in my 2 cents.
Most people are walking around with a sense that what you think and do, what you intend, and what then becomes your most deliberate voluntary action, is something that you as an agent are authoring, and that you really are responsible for this authorship, and that there's no one upstream who is pulling the marionette strings. What you're conscious of as a subject is not the totality of what's going on in your body. You're certainly not conscious of your genes transcribing proteins, and you're not conscious of most of the neural activity going on in your brain, right? So what you're conscious of includes, for most people, a felt sense that you are the thinker of your thoughts and the initiator of your actions, and you are an agent. You're a subject in consciousness. As opposed to just the kind of a space in which things are happening, right?
Mm-hmm. As we'll soon see, Harris ends up arguing that our minds are only exactly this, a passive playing field of manifestations, no more than a space in which things are happening of their own accord, rather than being any sort of actively organizing presence. Next here, notice that he allows for important gradations between more and less freedom of will, and yet by the end, we'll watch him turn his back entirely, for no apparent reason, on the whole project of gradation, with astonishing results.
No one's disputing, I'm not disputing, that there are important differences between voluntary and involuntary action. Mm-hmm. There are people who have neurological illnesses and impairments that give them less degrees of freedom. I mean, there are people who are phobic of certain things, or they have obsessive compulsive disorder, or they're you're blind, or there are things that can reduce your capacity to act, quote, freely in the world, and those reductions matter, mm-hmm. right?
If they matter in assessing degrees of voluntary versus involuntary behavior, then why can't a similarly supple, discerning spectrum apply in the case of a person's capacity to steer her or his choices in some systematic sense? Harris now shifts his stance, setting up an all-or-nothing binary between complete control and no control whatsoever, lacking any middle ground.
The moment where I decide to reach for this glass, it's coming now, but if you could return my brain and the universe to the state it was in a few moments ago, it might not have happened, right? Now, there is no scientific or philosophical reason to believe that, right? So everything we know about just how causes propagate in the universe, mm-hmm. whether you're talking about physics out there, or you're talking about the neurophysiology in here, or even if you're talking about the influence of some immaterial soul that you might think exists, right? Whatever concatenation of causes you think cause you to think and do the next thing you think and do, all of that is just happening. And if you set all of those causes back to where they were the moment ago, it's going to happen a trillion times in a row in the same way, mm-hmm. right?
He is no doubt right about this point, but what is he also avoiding? He's sidestepping the whole question of the contents of the state of mind that produce the chosen action, repeated a trillion times over, let's say. Mustn't these contents include some principle of selection, though? Some means of focus?
The insight is just obvious, because no one picked their parents, right? Therefore, no one picked their genomes. No one picked the society into which they were born. No one picked any of the environmental influences that played upon their genes so as to produce precisely the person they are. Mm-hmm. So there's not a cell in your body that you chose, and yet every cell in your body is expressing itself as the person that you are.
His premises here are correct, of course, as far as they go, but they go much nearer than he supposes. The thought experiment that he next takes Dave Rubin through Harris applies across the board to every possible thought itself without regard to type of thought or the context of the thinking experience itself.
If I asked you to think of a famous person right now, just think of somebody famous.
Mm-hmm.
And let's do this a few times just so you can be sensitive to the process. And now forget that famous person. Just think of a totally different famous person. Pick him or her.
Mm-hmm.
And do it one more time, but just pay attention to what the experience is like of picking a new famous person. Okay, so you have somebody?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now on either of those trials, did you think of Sylvester Stallone?
No.
Right, okay, so you know Sylvester Stallone is a famous person.
Right.
If we can't find freedom of will here, it's nowhere. I mean, this is as free as it gets, right? I mean, it's just you with your thoughts. You can take as long as you want. You could have taken an hour to think of a
Right.
famous person. You could have gone through the inventory of famous people and picked one. But let's find freedom here, right? Because this is you just picking without any coercion which famous person of all the famous names you know, which you're going to focus on there. So then there's the set of famous people who you know, who could have possibly occurred to you. Now, Sylvester Stallone, you know probably as well as anyone, right? And yet he didn't occur to you. What does it mean to say that you were free to pick him?
Mm-hmm.
Now, you were free in the sense that no one was standing at your head with a gun saying, listen, if you pick Sylvester Stallone, we're going to kill you, so don't
Right.
pick him, right? But what does it mean? I mean, in what sense were you free to pick someone who didn't occur to you to pick?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I would say as a matter of neurophysiology, that's a completely empty statement. I mean, your Sylvester Stallone circuits were just not active,
Right.
for whatever reason. A reason you didn't pick, right? A reason to which you don't stand as author. Now, absolutely everything in your life is like that. Everything, no matter how deliberative the decision, the person you choose to marry, whether you decide to get married or just live together, whether you want water versus tea. Well, I mean, so you can make it as long-term or as short-term as you want. There's in the darkness of your unconscious mind, all of which is preceded and kind of borne forward by your genes and the life circumstance and all of the ideas that get in or don't get in, the conversations you have and don't have. This full concatenation of causes, and you could add a dose of randomness to that, and you could add some magic from the soul realm too. Whatever is there,
Right.
You just have various thoughts and intentions springing into view, and you don't choose them. You can't think a thought before you think it, right? And so to choose your thoughts, you'd have to think them before you thought them, right? I mean, they just spring into view.
They just spring into view out of darkness. One just happens to think what one thinks. So what if that thinking is the writing of a book, for instance? Let me just choose a book at random here. So do these sentences, paragraphs, and chapters simply happen without the author's direction? Because, properly speaking, there is no author. But how could a single sentence, much less a paragraph or entire train of argument, ever arise in this fashion? Surely Harris wouldn't claim that the language here is arbitrarily arising, but he has nothing to say about who or what is supposed to mitigate this mere randomness and whip it into recognizable and publishable shape. Where is the lens through which all of the disparate forces lying behind our awareness are brought together to effect, marshaled into common cause to accomplish a goal? And if no lens is required, someone please explain to me how any rational gesture in the moment or stretching over time can possibly occur. If the author is not, after all, the self that we have imagined as a focal point behind our foreheads someplace, if this is an obvious illusion, as Harris contends, then we'll need to postulate, it seems, some other free-floating proxy elsewhere somewhere, equally intelligent and insightful and capable of construction. How else to construe order Yet doesn't this just shove the problem back a step, then another and another, into an infinite regress, a hall of mirrors? At some point we're going to need to locate an emanating source of logic, some strange doppelganger of self, perhaps, to replace our poor, outmoded delusion of a common sense self. But really, what's the difference? Harris's dismissal of self in favor of some unnamed and ultimately unknowable collusion of influences quickly begins to resemble the age-old God of the gaps argument, wherein whatever blank spots exist in our scientific knowledge of reality just get filled in by, oh, it must be God that did that, God that understands that, and we cannot. Harris and his fellow new atheists, of course, have long railed against this facile dodge, and yet here he is, grasping at the very same kind of hollow straw. When I am intensely engaged in a piece of writing, the thoughts that pop into my head tend, not always, but tend, to organically relate to the project at hand. Harris allows for no such tendency, but could not, of course, write his own books or deliver his lectures unless his mind, too, worked like this. The think of a random famous person analogy, that whole paradigm, doesn't fit whatsoever. So when it comes to thoughts, I would call for a reinstatement of the incremental nuance that he applied at the outset of his interview with Dave Rubin, because in practice we can readily tell the difference between a purposeful mental state, sharply on task and on target, and one that is kind of spacey or receptive or associative or adrift, a mere catch basin for a transpersonal rain of haphazard influences. Harris makes no provision for this vast difference or for all the way stations in between. Recently, neuroscience has discovered that in the act of decision-making, our conscious awareness of making those decisions is actually preceded by processes in the brain of which we are entirely clueless. fMRI readings demonstrate that simple choices between A and B can be detected up to 10 seconds before the subject himself believes he is freely making that choice.
10 seconds. This delay presumably reflects the operation of a network of high-level control areas that begin to prepare an upcoming decision long before it enters awareness. Or to put it another way, because your consciousness is predetermined, your free will is an illusion. You simply do not have the freedom that you think you have.
This is another perfect example of the kind of hyperbolic overreach committed by Sam Harris when he claims that just as we cannot predict which famous person will pop into our minds, we cannot ever, under any circumstances, control the direction of our own thoughts. But I'm saying, so what if our conscious experience of choosing in the instant is really the end result of subconscious processes of cognition? Why consign those processes to the realm of non-self, non-freedom, non-agency? So there is a gap, a lag time between the origination of a thought and its emergence into the full light of day for us. Wouldn't we even expect this to be the case, given the enormous complexity of our brains? Why not consider this originating phase part and parcel of our meaning-making faculty, instead of some mysterious, quasi-alchemical array of forces ineluctably, magically creating order out of chaos?